The chandelier light scattered across the marble floor like shards of ice, each gleam catching on the polished shoes and diamond bracelets of Vexley Manor's elite. It was the kind of evening where every smile felt rehearsed and every handshake was a transaction. Elena Monroe stood at the far end of the grand ballroom, clutching a silver tray of untouched champagne flutes. She wasn't supposed to be here. At least, not like this. In a plain black server's uniform, hair pulled tight, eyes cast down so no one would look too closely. But someone already had. Damien Davenport's voice carried easily over the string quartet's soft playing. "Careful, everyone," he said, raising his glass. "Wouldn't want our help to forget their place tonight." A ripple of laughter spread through the circle around him. Eyes turned, some amused, others uncomfortable. Elena kept her hands steady, but inside her pulse was a drumbeat. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Not yet. "Come on," Damien pressed, his tone dipping into a smirk. "Don't they teach you to greet your betters in whatever back alley you were found?" The words hit harder than she expected. Not because they were cruel, she'd heard worse, but because every syllable was laced with an arrogance he couldn't afford to have. Not once she decided to open her mouth. Somewhere near the balcony, a camera light flicked on. The local press was here. Perfect. Elena stepped forward, every click of her heels sharp against the floor. Her voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate. "Is this the part," she asked, "where you remind me that this house, this party, and even your company's money, all of it, once belonged to my family?" The music stopped. That Damien's smirk faltered for the first time. The guests leaned in, sensing something they didn't yet understand. And that was exactly how Elena wanted it, because tonight wasn't about serving drinks. It was about taking back what was hers, piece by piece, in front of everyone who had ever looked at her like she was nothing. Long before Danielle stood in that glittering ballroom, she was a young woman who knew the value of hard work more than anyone around her. Born in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Baltimore, she grew up listening to the steady hum of traffic outside and the occasional wail of sirens at night. Her mother worked double shifts as a waitress. Her father, once a proud mechanic, lost his job when the factory closed and never truly recovered. From the age of 16, Danielle understood that life would not hand her anything. She juggled school during the day and part-time work at a neighborhood grocery store at night. When her friends were out laughing in the summer heat, she was stocking shelves under fluorescent lights, trying to save enough to pay for nursing school. Nursing was not just a job to her. It was a calling. She had seen too many people in her neighborhood pass away from treatable conditions simply because they could not afford proper care. Danielle believed that being a nurse meant fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. She pushed through 4 years of grueling study, often eating instant noodles for dinner and taking the bus across town for her clinical shifts. She faced moments where she questioned if she would make it, when the rent was late, when her textbooks cost more than her paycheck, when exhaustion made her vision blur during night shifts at the hospital. But every time she was on the verge of giving up, she thought of her younger brother, Aaron, who looked at her as though she could move mountains. By the time Danielle graduated, she had learned how to stretch a dollar until it screamed, how to listen to people without judgment, and how to keep her voice calm even when her heart was racing. She found work at a busy emergency department, where chaos was the norm. Patients came in with everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries, and Danielle treated each one as though they were family. Outside of work, life was far from glamorous. Danielle lived in a modest apartment, kept her car running with duct tape and prayer, and rarely had time for anything beyond her shifts and caring for Aaron. But she was content, even proud. What she did not know was that her path would cross with Marcus Harrington in a way that neither of them could have predicted. From the outside, Marcus's life could not have been more different. He was the kind of man who appeared in glossy magazines, the CEO of Harrington Enterprises, a company with interests in real estate, technology, and high-end retail. He lived in a sprawling estate in Connecticut, drove cars worth more than most homes, and wore suits tailored so precisely they looked like they had been sewn onto him. To the public, Marcus was respected, admired, even envied. He attended charity galas and business conferences, spoke with authority about the economy, and moved in circles where everyone knew the price of everything but rarely the value of anything. Yet beneath the polish, there was distance. Marcus had few people he trusted. His success was built on discipline, careful control, and a belief that emotions were a liability. Those who worked for him respected his decisiveness, but they also knew that Marcus was not a man who invited personal connections. The bridge between their worlds should never have existed. Yet life, in its strange way, began to weave their stories together, not through a business deal or a chance meeting at a charity event, but through a quiet, unexpected moment in a hospital hallway that was a night Danielle would never forget. Rain battered the windows, the ER was overflowing, and she had been running from one patient to another without so much as a sip of water. A man in a dark suit stood at the far end of the corridor, his shoulders rigid, his expression unreadable. At first, she thought he was just another worried visitor. But then she noticed the faint tremor in his hands as he pressed a hand to his chest. Without hesitation, she walked over. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice steady but warm. He hesitated, then nodded, though his eyes betrayed the truth. She guided him to a chair, checked his pulse, and called for a doctor. Marcus Harrington did not tell her his name that night. He simply sat in silence as she placed a blanket around his shoulders and told him it would be all right. That small, unremarkable moment planted a seed neither of them could see, but it would grow, quietly, invisibly, until it brought them both to the very center of the ballroom. Humiliation that would change everything. The day began like any other for Danielle Hayes, until a single moment shifted everything. It was late afternoon at the Crestview Medical Center. Danielle had just finished her rounds in the pediatric ward when the emergency pager went off. A high-priority patient was being brought in from a private estate outside the city. No further details were given, only that he required immediate and discreet attention. She moved quickly, her steps echoing down the polished hallway. When the paramedics wheeled in the patient, Danielle froze for a fraction of a second. Lying on the gurney, pale and clearly in pain, was Marcus Whitford, the same man who had stood across the ballroom from her days earlier, the man whose world seemed untouchable. His tailored suits, his commanding presence, his guarded expressions. Everything about him had screamed distance and power. Now, all of that was stripped away. His eyes flickered open, and for a brief moment, they locked with hers. There was no recognition, only discomfort and the faintest trace of vulnerability. Danielle moved closer, checking his vitals with calm precision. "We need an immediate scan," she instructed, her voice steady despite the rush around her. "Let us get him stabilized before moving him anywhere else." Marcus did not speak much. His breathing was shallow, and he winced with each movement. But as the minutes passed, Danielle noticed something. He trusted her, not because of her uniform, but because she treated him like a person, not a title. She adjusted his oxygen mask, kept her tone gentle, and shielded him from unnecessary questions from the curious onlookers in the ward. Hours later, after the necessary treatment and observation, Marcus was cleared to rest in a private recovery suite. Danielle had stayed by his side longer than her shift required, ensuring no instructions were missed. Before she left, Marcus finally spoke. "You were the only one who looked me in the eye," he said quietly. His voice was still hoarse, but there was a depth to it now. "Everyone else kept looking at who I am, not at me," Danielle offered. A small, tired smile. "I just do my job, Mr. Whitford." Something about that answer lingered with him, but outside the glass walls of that recovery room, another set of eyes had been watching. Richard Kane. The same Richard who, in the ballroom, had smirked when Danielle was made to feel small. He was Marcus's business partner and, more importantly, someone who hated not being in control. From the hallway, Richard studied the interaction with narrowed eyes. Marcus, a man known for keeping his distance, was actually speaking to her. And not just speaking, engaging. By the time Danielle left the hospital that evening, Richard's mind was already moving. This woman, this nurse, had crossed an invisible line. In his world, proximity to Marcus meant influence, and influence was something Richard guarded like treasure. The next morning, Richard called his assistant into his office. "Find out everything about her," he ordered. "Where she works, who she talks to, every place she has ever been connected to. If she is in Marcus's ear, I want her out." Publicly. It was not enough for Richard to quietly remove her from Marcus's orbit. He wanted humiliation, the kind that would make her retreat permanently. He wanted Marcus to see her as trouble, a liability, someone unworthy of being in his presence. Unaware of the storm forming in the shadows, Danielle went about her life. She returned to her small apartment on the edge of the city, shared dinner with her younger sister, and tried to put the unexpected encounter with Marcus out of her mind. But something about his words, "You were the only one who looked me in," the eye stayed with her. She did not know why it mattered, but it did. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself thinking of the nurse more than he wanted to admit. In his circles, people either wanted something from him or feared him. She had been different, and though he could not place why, he felt a pull to understand her better. Richard, however, was counting on that curiosity, and the first seed of his plan had already been planted. Danielle noticed the first change the very next morning. She arrived at the hospital early, as always, to make her rounds before the morning rush. The air still carried that faint scent of antiseptic and coffee, the usual comfort of her shift. But something was off. Her locker, which she always kept locked, was open. Inside, her neatly folded spare scrubs were gone, replaced with a crumpled stain set 2 sizes too large. A childish note was taped to the inside. "Thought you might need a fresh look." Her pulse quickened, but she told herself it was nothing. Hospitals were stressful places. People played pranks. She changed quietly, keeping her head down, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her upset. But as the days went on, the pranks multiplied. Her patient files went missing just before shift changes, forcing her to scramble to rewrite them from memory. Equipment she had prepped mysteriously vanished, only to be found later in storage rooms she had no reason to enter. Conversations in the break room would go silent the moment she walked in. She had been in difficult work environments before, but this was different. This was targeted. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed entirely removed from the undercurrents of hostility. Or so she thought. His visits to the hospital were infrequent but noticeable. Whenever he walked in, the air shifted. Conversations softened, postures straightened. The wealthy businessman had that effect on people. Danielle avoided direct interaction with him, partly because she assumed their worlds would never truly overlap again, and partly because she knew how quickly kindness from someone in his position could be misinterpreted. Then one afternoon, she caught him watching her. She was in the pediatric wing, leaning over the bed of a young girl who had been admitted for complications after surgery. The girl's face was pale, her eyes tired, and Danielle had been reading her a silly story to coax a smile. The laugh finally came, quiet but genuine, and Danielle's own heart lifted with it. When she looked up, Marcus was standing just outside the doorway. His usual stern expression had softened, and for a brief second, he seemed almost hesitant, as though he was witnessing something he could not quite name. Their eyes met, but before she could speak, he turned and walked away. That evening, Danielle found her shift suddenly extended by 2 hours without warning. A nurse from another floor claimed they needed coverage, but she overheard 2 colleagues snickering about how she was too desperate to say no. She swallowed her exhaustion and finished the extra work because walking away was not an option. Bills did not pay themselves. The sabotage, however, was becoming harder to ignore. One day, she was accused of misplacing a patient's medication, a serious claim that could have cost her the job she depended on. Danielle spent hours combing through charts until she finally discovered that the medication had been signed out under her name, but in handwriting that was not hers. She reported it to her supervisor, but the matter was dismissed as a clerical error. That night, she sat in her small kitchen, the ticking of the clock loud in the silence. Her son, Caleb, was asleep. In the next room, his schoolwork spread across the table where he had fallen asleep earlier. She brushed a hand over his notebook, tracing the uneven handwriting. He was the reason she pushed through every insult, every whispered comment, every quiet act meant to push her out. She could take the blows, but she would not let anyone jeopardize his stability. What Danielle did not know was that Marcus had noticed more than she realized. While she believed their lives barely intersected, he had begun to observe the way her coworkers treated her. The subtle cold shoulders, the way tasks meant for others somehow landed on her plate, the dismissive tones. He had not yet stepped in, unsure of the history, but something about the quiet strength she carried unsettled him. Richard Kane, however, had no such hesitation. He had seen Marcus's eyes follow Danielle that day in the pediatric wing, and it was enough to ignite something sharp and calculating in him. Richard had always positioned himself close to Marcus, leveraging charm and money to remain in his inner circle. But Marcus showing interest, professional or otherwise, in someone like Danielle threatened that carefully curated balance, and Richard played the long game. He began feeding subtle lies into conversations Marcus overheard, suggesting Danielle had a history of workplace drama, hinting she was overly ambitious, even manipulative, beneath her calm demeanor. In a place like this, reputation was currency, and Richard intended to bankrupt hers before it could gain any value. Danielle could sense the shift in the air growing heavier. It was no longer just annoyance or pettiness. It was the kind of cold calculation that told her someone wanted her gone. But leaving was not an option. She had faced worse before, and she would face this too. What she did not yet understand was that her quiet resilience was not just surviving the storm. It was beginning to change its direction. The grand ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, every facet catching the golden light like frozen fireworks. Guests in silk gowns and tailored suits glided between tables draped in ivory, their laughter blending with the soft hum of a live string quartet. Danielle stood near the far edge of the room, close enough to see the stage, but far enough to be forgotten. She had been invited to this charity gala as a quiet gesture of thanks from the hospital board, or so she thought. She held a tray of champagne flutes, not because she was working, but because someone had mistakenly handed it to her earlier, and no one had offered to take it back. That was how it often went in rooms like this. She was invisible until someone needed a favor. Across the room, Marcus Kane was deep in conversation with a circle of high-profile donors. His expression was calm, but his eyes scanned the crowd like a man reading a room for signs of trouble. When his gaze landed on Danielle, something unreadable flickered there. A memory, a silent acknowledgement. She felt it, but before she could react, Richard Kane's voice cut through the air like a polished blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began from the stage. "Tonight, we celebrate generosity and distinction. And what better way than to honor those who rise above their stations?" His pause was deliberate, the smile tight. The crowd chuckled politely. "We have among us a very determined woman who found herself in our world under the most curious circumstances." Danielle's stomach tightened. She felt eyes shift in her direction before her name was even spoken. "Danielle Brooks," Richard announced, gesturing toward her. "Come join us." She hesitated, the tray in her hands trembling just enough for the champagne to ripple. Every step toward the stage felt like wading through water. The whispers rose, feather-light but sharp, until she was standing beside Richard under the glaring lights. "Now," Richard continued, "most of you know me as a man who values integrity, and I think it is only fair to share an inspiring little story about our guest." His voice dripped with practiced warmth, but his eyes were cold steel. "You see, Danielle once worked as a nurse. Admirable, yes. But recently, she found herself in the company of my dear brother Marcus during a rather inconvenient situation." Laughter, soft at first, then bolder. Danielle kept her chin high, but her pulse hammered in her ears. She offered help. "Of course," Richard went on, "but what she did not mention to anyone is that she is not exactly who she appears to be. In fact, some might question her motives for being here tonight." The air thinned. Danielle's mind raced. What was he implying? That she had schemed her way into this room? That she had overstepped an invisible line? Richard leaned closer to the microphone, voice lowering into mock concern. "Perhaps, Danielle, you would like to tell everyone why you really approached Marcus that day?" Before she could speak, the tray slipped from her hands, glasses shattering against the polished floor. Gasps broke out like sparks from a fire. And then, Marcus moved. Not just moved, but strode forward with a force that pulled the entire room's attention. He stepped between her and Richard, his tall frame casting a shadow across the stage lights. "You will not speak to her like that," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying each word a strike. Richard blinked, caught off guard. "Brother, I was merely—" "No," Marcus cut him off, turning to face the audience. "You were trying to humiliate the one person here who has shown more courage and compassion than half this room combined." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked from the press section, capturing every angle. She was there for me when no one else was. Marcus continued, his voice rising now, commanding the space. Not because she wanted anything, not because she knew my name, but because she saw a human being in need and acted. That is what integrity looks like. That is what character is. Danielle's chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from the shock of hearing her truth laid bare in front of people who had only seen her as an outsider. Marcus turned to Richard, his jaw set. If you cannot respect that, then perhaps you should leave your own event. The silence that followed was electric, heavy with disbelief. No one dared to move. Richard's smile faltered, his polished mask slipping just enough for the cameras to catch. Marcus stepped closer to Danielle, offering his arm. "Come with me," he said simply. As they walked off the stage together, the audience parted like water, their stares a mix of curiosity, shame, and something else, the uneasy recognition that they had just witnessed a fracture in the polished surface of their world. Somewhere behind them, applause began. Soft at first, then stronger, until it filled the hall. But Danielle did not look back. The morning after the gala felt strangely quiet. Danielle sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Her phone was flooded with messages, some from colleagues, some from strangers, each one echoing the same sentiment. They had seen what Marcus did, and they admired her courage. The night's events had spread far beyond the marble halls of the Kane estate. By mid-morning, a knock echoed through her apartment. When she opened the door, Marcus stood there, not in a tailored suit, but in a simple jacket, looking more human than she had ever seen him. In his hand, he held an envelope. "Danielle," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Last night was only the beginning. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a chance to stand where you deserve to stand." She took the envelope hesitantly, sliding out the thick paper inside. It was not a letter, it was an official appointment. A position on the board of a community health foundation, with funding to expand services for families who had nowhere else to turn. Her name, in bold print, looked almost unreal. Danielle looked up, stunned. "Why me?" Marcus met her gaze without hesitation. "Because integrity cannot be bought, Danielle. And I watched you hold your ground when the world tried to tear you down. That kind of strength changes things, changes people." It was not just Marcus who had shifted. Within days, her name began circulating in spaces she had never imagined. Local news stations wanted interviews. A national nursing association reached out to honor her work. Former patients wrote letters recalling the nights she had stayed past her shift to comfort their families. Even Richard Kane, once so determined to see her fall, could no longer ignore the tide. At the next public event, he approached her, not with his usual coldness, but with something that looked uncomfortably like respect. "It appears," he admitted quietly, "that I underestimated you." Danielle did not smile or gloat. She simply replied, "It happens," and walked past him, her head held high. Weeks later, at a packed community gathering, she took the stage for the first time in her life. The audience was a mix of neighbors, healthcare workers, and influential figures who once would not have noticed her in a room. She spoke not about the humiliation or the injustice, but about the power of standing for one another. "There will always be those who try to decide your worth for you," she said, her voice steady. "But worth is not granted, it is lived. And when you live it, no one can take it away." Applause filled the hall, but Danielle's eyes found Marcus in the crowd. He did not look like the distant figure from the night they met. He looked like an ally, someone who had not only seen her value but had chosen to amplify it in the weeks that followed. Danielle poured herself into her new role. She pushed for mobile clinics in underserved areas. She secured funding for mental health programs. She became a voice for those who, like her once, had worked tirelessly in the shadows. Her apartment remained the same size, her coffee still brewed in the same chipped mug, but her world had grown larger than she ever thought possible. For the first time in years, Danielle felt she was not simply surviving. She was shaping something lasting. And every step she took forward reminded her that dignity, once defended, could light the way for countless others. Weeks had passed since the gala, but the echo of that night still lingered in Cedar Heights. Danielle now had offers from prestigious hospitals and community clinics. Her name had become a quiet symbol of grace under fire. But while others imagined her in a sleek office with a corner view, Danielle's heart kept pulling her somewhere else. One bright Saturday morning, she walked through the familiar doors of Cedar Heights Community Clinic, the place where she had stitched wounds, soothed frightened children, and sat with grieving families long after her shift was over. The staff froze for a moment, surprised to see her. "Danielle, we thought you would be off saving lives in New York or Los Angeles," one nurse said. With a smile, Danielle simply shrugged, her voice calm but certain. "This is where I am needed. Fancy walls and high pay do not heal people. Hearts do. And this is where my heart belongs." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Even Marcus, who had come by to donate new medical equipment, stood by the doorway watching her with a look of deep respect. She turned to him, smiling softly. "Thank you for opening a door for me, but I had to choose the one that leads home." Marcus nodded, understanding more than words could express. He extended his hand, not in charity, not in pity, but in solidarity. "Then let us make this place the best it can be." Outside, life moved on. The wealthy still hosted glittering parties, and the city still buzzed with ambition. But in that small clinic, Danielle picked up her stethoscope, ready to serve the people who needed her most. IT was not the path others would have chosen for her, but it was hers, and that made all the difference.